Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. I'm Simon Cawdery, and I'm delighted to be rejoined in the studio by Adam Butler. Adam, of course, is the Chief Investment Officer at Resolve Asset Management right here in the Cayman Islands and an occasional host of Money Sense. So, Adam, thank you for joining me as we delve into some topics this morning.
Yeah, delve. Wow. That's such a trigger word for anyone in AI. It's like every AI response for many months responded with, let me delve into this topic.
I guess part of it is because I'm not sure what we're going to find.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a murkier undercurrent of confusion. Anyway, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the T word. That could be misconstrued in so many different ways, so I'm going to explain that. That's tariffs. It does seem to be on everyone's mind, and I think it's fair to say a lot of people don't quite know what to make of what has been going on and why. So rather than me sort of start off with a specific question, tariffs, explain them, just give us your first thoughts when you hear the word tariff in the context of today's climate. What comes to mind to you and why?
I mean, traditionally, tariffs have been triggered in response to bad actions by one or more states against another state in terms of either devaluing their currency to make their exports more attractive, or engaging in internal oversupply type policy. China has been accused as an example of over-investing and supporting their domestic investment in manufacturing and production for export purposes. In other words, employing a mercantilist economic model.
So they produce far more than they can possibly domestically consume, and therefore oversupply means they have to export it, which at the price point that they can produce at undercuts everyone else. And it's state supported, and so people think that's unfair trade competition.
Yeah, that's right. It disadvantages the manufacturers in the country that is importing these goods that are cheaper than they would be otherwise if the state wasn't stepping in and supporting their production, therefore lowering their costs, right? And you can certainly say that in many cases today we do have countries engaged in these types of practices, right? And so, it's not strange or unusual for people to begin to talk about more aggressive trade policy approaches to try to discourage this behavior. Though it is generally universally accepted that tariffs in general are not just zero-sum types of policies that rarely achieve their intended objectives, but are often negative sum in that, yes, the policies do end up protecting and therefore allowing very narrow segments of domestic industry to flourish, but it's the expense of consumers pay more, they have less to spend, other parts of the economy then are hit, and that the extra benefits to the target sectors do not offset the more broad negative consequences to the citizenry.
Part of what I'm hearing from you there triggers a thought in my mind, which is often that doesn't matter from a political perspective because it's the narrow target set, which is your voting bloc, and the $5 cost to 20 million people is mostly irrelevant compared to the $1,000 benefit that 50,000 people may get, who are the people you're targeting. And so that's part of the political narrative that goes on behind the scenes as to why to do something. Who cares if we hurt a lot of people if they're never going to be our voting bloc? What we're focused on is trying to target action that will benefit a very narrow group of people who are specifically part of our voting bloc.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute point. And, that's more likely to take place in periods where the voting blocks are more diametrically opposed. And at the moment, we obviously have an extremely divided citizenry politically, right? And so it may be more beneficial for politicians in the current climate to take or embrace policies that benefit their constituency and harm the other side.
Yeah.
in order to maintain power.
Let me ask a question, and I'm going to throw my parents under a bus here, because they now use Uber. And amazingly, they thought, wow, this is so cheap. And everyone else has been knowing this for a number of years. There'll be a point to this story. But so my parents use Uber, and they say, well, how's it so cheap? I say, well, SoftBank is subsidizing it, or the investors in this are subsidizing it. And they go, well, that's great news. It's great that someone's paying me a subsidy to have a cheaper product. So why is it not great when China is giving a subsidy to a product to make your TV or your radio or whatever it is cheaper? That benefits me, surely, doesn't it? Why is that a bad thing? Why do I not want to have cheaper products?
Yeah, it's, I think we chatted about this before the show, but I think it's worthwhile. My microphone's off.
Yeah, just try. We're having a microphone problem. Try the other one.
Let's move. Yeah, how about this one? Is this good?
Sorry.
I don't know what happened. My microphone. I think we were chatting before the show about the fact that there's no universally accepted school of economics. That there's neoclassicists, which kind of have dominated the narrative over the last 15 or 20 years under this sort of neoliberal evolution of global politics. But there's also Keynesianism and Austrian economics and Ricardian economics, and there's a variety of different lenses through which to view any kind of policy. And there are schools of economics that look very favorably on the fact that that states engage in very active industrial policy, where they are favoring certain industries strategically because they have a long-term view about their strategic advantage or strategic relevance. In China, they've obviously invested massively in building whole cities in anticipation of a multi-generational migration from the countryside into urban centers, this sort of migration into a broader middle class in China. And the West laughed at all of these ghost cities. But slowly but surely, most of these are now filling up with migrants from the countryside. And they've therefore invested massively in public transit. They've got one of the best, most advanced train systems in the world. They've got the most advanced and heavily scaled electric vehicle and solar cell industries. These were strategic priorities 5 years ago. And because the state was so focused and they have more power in China, they were able to mobilize an enormous amount of activity and investment in those industries, and they become global leaders.
But that has led to every time I buy anyone in Cayman who buys a solar panel is paying less for that.
Exactly.
And so why is that a bad thing? That's the sort of question that perhaps might trip off the tongue of somebody.
Well, yeah, because there's a few reasons why it could be a bad thing, but one of the reasons is that it is the general principle of Western economics that the state subsidization is typically a misallocation of capital, and the private sector is going to be more effective at determining where to invest and where to spend money. And so any interference by the state is looked upon or frowned upon by typically leaders in the West, especially, in the U.S. And so, the U.S. wants to be able to avoid or minimize industrial policy or interference by the state. And to the extent that other countries are engaging in high-powered industrial policy, that undermines, at least in the short term, the efforts of the West to continue to try to empower the private sector over the public sector, right? So this ends up being a bit of an ideological question, right? Is capitalism in general more effective, in other words, empowering the private sector over the long term, likely to lead to better human flourishing than the state in getting more involved, engaging in more strategic long-term industrial policy? It is a very, there was an entire movement in the 30s and 40s, remember McCarthyism, where the Americans were terrified of a migration to a communist way of thinking, right? And I see this type of ideological divide energizing a lot of the debate underlying these different trade policies that we see manifesting at the moment.
But what seems ironic to me is you mention in that narrative a lot of points about how it's a divide between a Western ideology of getting government out of the way, and the reason perhaps for having tariffs is to level a playing field against state interference elsewhere. But by their very definition, imposing taxes, which is what a tariff is state interference. So how does that circle become squared in that sense? Because taxes, I forget who gave the quote, but taxes are one of the most difficult things to ever get rid of once they've been introduced. People just get used to them. So introducing and permitting new taxes is simply a recipe often, or has historically been a recipe for building upon more and more tariffs, more and more taxes in other respects. So what's the end game to this? You introduce a tariff, which then you promise doesn't become a permanent thing as soon as something else changes. How does that really ever happen philosophically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier to roll back taxes than it is to impose new taxes, typically. I mean, obviously,
governments get very comfortable with the revenue that's generated.
That's true, but the citizens are always highly receptive to lowering taxes and are unreceptive to increases in taxes. Increasing taxes is almost universally, regardless of your economic or your political persuasion, unattractive.
But tariffs aren't often considered by the general citizen as a tax because it's not a tax that comes out of their paycheck.
Well, they don't see it. It's like inflation is not considered a tax, but it actually is a tax. Yeah. And it's a tax on people who spend more of their income relative to those who save more of their income, right? And therefore, it's a highly regressive tax. Obviously, the less well-off need to spend almost all of the income they earn, and therefore they feel the impacts of inflation a lot more than somebody who earns a lot more money. They save half their money invested in stocks and bonds, what have you, but they are only spending half their income on goods and services that have escalated in price, right? So taxes are highly regressive. Tariffs are also highly regressive because they are punitive on consumption, right? So who feels the impact of tariffs? Those who have to buy goods that are now more expensive because they've been taxed as they enter the country, right? Now, in theory, this motivates or incentivizes domestic industry to reshore, right? Like the last 20 or 30 years have been dominated by this offshoring dynamic where companies in the West want to migrate their manufacturing as much as possible into lower cost jurisdictions and into jurisdictions that will allow them to externalize costs that are regulated in the U.S., right? They can impose environmental costs and other types of costs that are not acceptable in the U.S. or Canada or Australia, et cetera, right? So there's been this movement to offshore. Well, tariffs obviously are designed to both punish trade partners who are engaging in policies that are run against the ideological position of in this case, Western governments, but also to incentivize the redevelopment of domestic manufacturing, right? We're going to bring instead of sourcing all these goods now from offshore, we're going to build up our internal manufacturing base that will, in theory, be good for employment. We're going to bring back good, sustainable jobs. We're going to produce real things in America instead of just trading back and forth in financial markets, which has, become an increasingly large portion of the domestic economy. And so, in these ways, you can view tariffs in a bit of a positive light. It's just that empirically and mechanically, it ends up not typically working out the way that you expect, or at least the gains you get where you do have these ambitions to improve your domestic situation, they tend to be offset by a variety of other factors that are either intended consequences that you felt were going to be much less impactful, or unintended consequences that you just didn't budget for when you came up with this strategy.
I remember many years ago now, the UK had tariffs on car imports and to protect the UK's domestic car production. And now, good luck if you can find a UK car manufacturer. Lots of cars are made in the UK, but they're made by foreign companies because the UK manufacturing base just needed to be destroyed because it was making bad product. And that you can protect bad product, but that doesn't mean anyone really wants it. And part of the problem ends up being that you protect something which obsoletes itself because of inefficiencies and just bad work practice or just bad quality or bad output. And so you could protect something through a tariff, but it could have negative consequences. We're going to take a short break in a second, but I just want to draw an analogy because you mentioned about how tariffs are this hidden tax. And I think perhaps a lot of people, when they hear that, go, I don't really understand that. I'm not sure I follow that. But the analogy I want to draw is right here in Cayman, because Cayman has tariffs on every product, almost every product. And so everything in the supermarket, everything that we buy in Cayman is subject to approximately 30%, 20 to 30% tariff. There are some exceptions. And so we are charging tariffs on other products, which makes everything that we buy more expensive. So it is a tax on every single consumer in the Cayman Islands. And so if you think to yourself, how much cheaper would your shopping bill be if every product were 20% cheaper? It would presumably be around about 20% cheaper. How would that do? What would that do to the cost of living for someone on $1 million? Not much. Wouldn't really affect them so much. What would it do to someone on $40,000 a year if their shopping bill were 20% cheaper? It would have a huge disposable income benefit because that makes a real difference. And so to your point about how it affects people on lower incomes, just think about it from the Cayman perspective. If everything that you bought, and you're consuming so much because you have only a little amount of income, if it were so much lower, you'd be much better off as a result of it. So that's the sort of impact that tariffs have and how it's skewed between the wealthy and the unwealthy in a sense. So with that ringing in everyone's ears, let's just take a brief 30-second break and then we'll rejoin on this conversation.
Radio Cayman, maintaining the innovation.
On a daily basis, making it easy to connect with you, our listeners. Add us to WhatsApp today, 925-3261. That's 925-3261.
Radio Cayman.
Send a text or voice note.
Message us at 925-3261 on WhatsApp today and get active with Radio Cayman.
Radio Cayman, the voice of the Cayman Islands.
Radio Cayman, maintaining the innovation.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense, where I'm joined again in the studio this morning by Adam Butler as we're talking tariffs, the economy and markets. We had a good conversation before the break, Adam, about what are tariffs, what they can do. But perhaps let's just sort of take a step or 14 back and go, why? What's going, and this may be a difficult question to both ask and answer, what's going through the mind of somebody who starts that conversation? And you may want to think of that in the specific or the general, depending on whether one can want to delve into certain minds.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's been interesting about these tariffs is they seem to be a lot less about trade and a lot more about achieving policy objectives like, reducing illegal immigration, reducing the flow of drugs across borders, these types of things. So it's interesting to watch Trump's approach, and anyone who's watched him on his game show or,
we're talking about not the White House now when you say game
show.
Yeah.
The prior game shows knows that he has a certain negotiating style, let's call it, right? And he prefers a negotiating style that is kind of like a game of chicken, right? And the way to win, or at least seek the greatest advantage in a game of chicken, is what's called the madman policy, right? Or more technically, with strategic ambiguity. So the idea is that you make to the world or to your competition as if you don't care about consequences. You are ready to take whatever consequences might come in order to win the game, right? If you're in a game of chicken, especially if you're in a more powerful position, so think about a traditional game of chicken with two cars. Like you've got Canada and the U.S. The U.S. is driving a cement truck, and Canada's driving one of those new
hybrid
Fiats,
vehicle, presumably,
right? Yeah, and it's not just the fact that Canada is operating at a major trade disadvantage or strategic disadvantage. in terms of like the different weights of the cars, but also how likely is it that Trump is going to follow through on policies that are everybody kind of agrees are going to be mutually destructive, right? Well, if Canada thinks that Trump's just bluster and he's not going to follow through on these policies because he understands that they would be mutually destructive, Canada is more likely to engage in competitive behavior, right? They're less likely to concede. Whereas if Canada believes that Trump is, quote, a madman and is willing to accept whatever consequences in order to follow through, then not just is Trump operating with a much heavier vehicle or a better poker hand, but he's also operating with at an advantage in terms of what his relative intentions are and what his relative capacity to endure the consequences are, right? So this is like a well-played bully style of negotiating tactic, and it has proven to be very effective over time, especially when played from a position of power, right?
What confuses me, though, is this is round 2. We've had 4 years of this before. Why? It seems as though politicians elsewhere in the world haven't awoken to this idea and have said, oh yeah, he's absolutely going to do it, whereas all the evidence suggests he wouldn't ever.
Well, I mean,
all the evidence.
I think you might look back on his previous term and say that because he was surrounded by more traditional Republican political guides and aides and he was vastly more constrained in his capacity to do what he wanted to do in his first term, and that he doesn't have those same constraints.
But that could just be part of the wonderful tapestry of the same game, which is surround yourself with people that make you look more like the madman, so that people have that negotiation belief. That doesn't mean you are. It just means you surround yourself with people who will act in the same sort of way, so as to reinforce a message. But a message isn't action. Yeah, I mean
the great thing for Trump is that no one has called his bluff yet, right?
Why do you think not?
Well, I think because he's done such a great job with the strategic ambiguity. Not only is he operating from a position of power, and people perceive him as being a bit of a madman in terms of, he equivocates, he is unclear in his statements, he doesn't really give you explicit guides or targets on what he's focused on, right? He uses this ambiguity as a tool to keep everybody guessing, and therefore, you can't really catch him out or call his bluff because you don't quite know what he's going for, right? And this all makes it very difficult for people to react and respond strategically.
Do you think there's a difference between what we see right now, which are defined in a sense as a short-term response, versus what is likely to happen over the next 5 to 15 years? And I say that because there must be a lot of people who look at this and go, there's some ambiguity as to whether this long-term partnership, this friendship with this country is sustainable, and perhaps we ought to re-engage with China. Maybe we ought to re-engage with the BRICS countries, whatever it might be. Maybe we ought to consider where we might be able to do business. Now that doesn't change. You can't change things. You can't change the old analogy. You can't change a steamship. You can't turn a boat in the water straight away. But the small changes now could have long-term lasting consequences long after all of what's being done today, which could potentially be to the disadvantage of the US, because it could lose some of the influence that it has today because of its reliability, shall we say, which has been profound for 40, 50 years, frankly. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a potential concern or worry? Or obviously it's too longer term for anyone in power to ever care about, but do you think it's a problem for the states in that way?
Well, I mean, the problem in the intermediate and long term is that policies need to survive in the short term, and politicians that espouse policies need to survive in the short term. The reality is the U.S. itself comprises such a large portion of global consumption that there's not really any way to avoid trade with the U.S. or minimize trade with the U.S. And try to make up for that trade through bilateral agreements with other countries. So, I don't see that as a viable short-term solution. The other side of this is that Trump has said that there's the whole idea of the BRICS as an example, right? Which is this emerging multilateral trade group that is Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and a variety of other countries are trying to create. Well, Trump has said if they continue to proceed with this, then he will impose very high sanctions on trade with countries that try to espouse this new trade union, right?
I wondered about that, and I'm pleased you brought it up, because it seemed to me as though an obvious long-term beneficiary of this sort of current action would be non-dollar denominated currencies, because you do business outside of the tariffable or the taxable or the controllable currency. And for a long time, the EU's tried to promote the euro. For a long time, China's tried to promote its own version. But this, logically, absent the scare tactics, this should engender positivity towards those sorts of approaches, shouldn't it?
Yeah, maybe. But again, if the U.S. is going to impose consequences on any country that engages in policies that try to circumvent U.S. trade policy, the U.S. Trump has made clear that he is happy to escalate against any country that defects in that way. So, the short-term pain that might accrue from
some of those countries
like that,
some of those countries may not care quite as much. Saudi Arabia probably wouldn't care. It would just change its oil supply. Would have an OPEC-style 1970s crisis in terms of energy. They could weather that far better than the US could.
Saudi Arabia is a bit of a unique case because the US is basically has enough of domestic oil supply to supply their domestic needs. They're like a net exporter now. Now, the mix of the energy that it needs, it will benefit from trade, right? So it does need some Saudi sweet crude to go to certain types of ports. It does need heavy sour crude from Canada to come to different refineries in the Northwest and in California, et cetera. So the mix of crude products would certainly be challenging in the short term. But ultimately, the U.S. could reformat its domestic energy production and refining operations to be almost completely self-sufficient, given 5 or 10 years, especially with all the deregulation that's going on, right? So Saudi Arabia is a bit of a different story. But if you're exporting goods that are either directly for consumption or are parts of other, more complex goods that are going to be assembled elsewhere and then sold into the U.S., then those types of trade policies are ultimately going to be massive short-term failures.
I wonder, we've got about a minute left. I'm curious on your thoughts here. Do you think in 20, 30 years' time, will those people who are studying economics as we might have done 20, 30 years ago, will look back and be reading new textbooks which will say there was a different way of doing things? Because this sort of approach was never really talked about. There was never a country that existed which could be self-sufficient in all possible ways. The US has always historically been dependent on others for certain other things. Do you think we'll look back and say, there is a economic argument to do this sort of thing, and it could have worked? Do you think that's possible?
No, I don't think so. I think that we're going to look back in 20 or 30 years and think that this was one of the most barbarous, misguided periods of human history. We've spent the last 20 years embracing a global extractive, exploitative economic policy. We've got so much capital that capital is no longer a constraint, and therefore, really competition in the form of which actors are either most able to or most willing to externalize costs onto the commons are the ones that have most benefited, right? We've got this whole policy of shareholder yield maximization that is a beggar thy neighbor policy in aggregate. We're already up against biosphere boundaries in terms of resource extraction. We're constantly engaging in zero-sum races to the bottom in virtually every industry. So Yeah, I think we're going to look back after a major catastrophic ravine over the next 5 or 10 years and realize that we were on a really misguided path.
Well, there we go. Always like to end a show with a catastrophic ravine ahead of us. That's precisely what we want to know. All seriously, thank you, Adam. It's been a very stimulating and interesting conversation. I think there's a lot that could be talked about in this particular topic, whether it be economics or psychology, because I think it's a combination of both. And I think those who look at it purely through an economics lens, as you rightly said, are misunderstanding 80% of what's going on here. It's not purely about economics; it's about other things. So do keep that in mind as you pay attention to the news, or just don't pay attention to the news and save yourself the heartache.
Enjoy the beach.
Yeah, because what's in the news one day isn't the same thing as what's in the news the next day. They could be completely opposite. With that, just remains me to say thank you to our listeners for tuning in and devoting some of your morning to our show. And please do rejoin Money Sense again in 2 weeks' time.